Okay, we are back, and thank you. I think we've had really a fantastic opening, and if that's a self-serving comment, that's entirely acceptable. We're very, very fortunate, and so what we've tried to do is create content that actually fits. It's not about creating a bunch of really talented speakers. It's hopefully having a theme and telling a story, and really, if we're fortunate enough that the content actually aligns sequentially, then we're fortunate, and I think we've actually done so. So our next presenter is Richard Burridge. Richard has led and founded a consumer research firm in Vietnam. He's been in Vietnam since 1997, and that entire time it's really been understanding consumer behavior. And so what we've heard earlier this morning is 2024 has been fueled by manufacturing, it's been fueled by export growth. And what does 2025 look like? Well, if Vietnam is going to be successful in reaching its growth goals, it's really going to be on the back of domestic consumption. And so as we look at our portfolios, and we'll hear from our head of listed equities and our head of research immediately after Richard, let's really understand how the consumer is, what their spending patterns look like, how they're feeling, what their outlook is on life. So give me great pleasure to introduce Richard Burridge. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vina Capital, for having me. Thank you, Eric. Lovely to see you all. I'm going to talk through some of the larger trends in the long term, but also some of the shorter trends that we've seen this year, and give you an overview of what the market looks like from a consumer demand perspective, most certainly, and perhaps what the future might look like going forward. I've been introduced, so I won't say much more other than I'm old and I've been here too long. My presentation today, you can download it at cimigo.com, so you don't need to take photos. Feel free to do so. Just go to reports. I have a question for you all, and you can shout out if you would, because I would like you to participate today. And what do you, as the audience, think are going to be the key factors fueling Vietnam's growth over the next 10 years? Just shout out. What do you think is going to, Michael's given you some clues. What do you think is going to impact Vietnam's growth over the next decade? Anybody? Consumption, domestic consumption, any others? Infrastructure, thank you. Anyone else? Please shout. Digital leaps, absolutely. I agree with all of those. These are the 8 reasons that I would put forth, and these are the 8 reasons I'm going to talk through today to give you a perspective on why we certainly think Vietnam's got a great 10, 12 years ahead, as Michael also alluded to. You've seen the GDP growth, you've seen it, I'm sure, many, many times, and will over the next few days, but it's averaging 6% over the last decade. So our history gives us some great hope to look forward. These numbers are 2023 numbers for the full year, and it just gives you a very quick snapshot. As you know, I'm a market research guy, so I love the numbers, but it gives you an idea of how the digital economy is evolving. Retail sales last year really did jump quite significantly at nearly 10%. We've got a banked market of 75% of adults now banked, so a very financially savvy consumer base. Some key sectors didn't do so well last year. Automotive was down 27%. Real estate, we all know, was very depressed last year, so much lower sales than in prior years. Digital leaps, we had a $30 billion digital economy last year, so that's 7% of GDP in Vietnam. So some very impressive gains and progress in 2023. We're sitting at a per capita income of 4,300. The bubble size is population, as you might imagine, and that's how we look like to some of our regional neighbors. So we've got a way to go from lower middle to upper middle, but there's a lot of great prospects, and if you join lunch today, you will certainly hear more about the expectations for that progress. This data is just the latest data up until Q3 2024. We surpassed 100 billion in exports this quarter. Last year, the whole year was 355 billion. So a massive increase in exports, as Michael has talked to. Consumer inflation has come down, a bit lower than most of us would have expected, but a GDP growth there of 7.4% for the quarter. over prior year. So we're expecting about 6.6% economic growth for the full year. More sophisticated production, greater global interconnectivity and supply chain, fantastic FDI performance, as we've just seen. It's partly China plus one, but it's a lot of other things that are happening. So we've gone 20 years ago, 4% of Vietnam's exports were high-tech goods. In 2023, 40% were. So we're seeing great progress in the value add, but also the advanced technology that's used by manufacturers in this country. Of course, a lot of that is FDI exports. Someone mentioned it earlier, it's just over 70%. Over-reliance in China and some good companies coming in and helping the industrialization of Vietnam's economy. Tourism hit 12.7 million inbound international tourists year to date. So that's above where we were in 2023 for full year, and it's also above where we were in 19 for September year to date. So we're kind of back at 2019 levels for inbound tourism, and it's certainly helped with some of the retail demand, which I want to focus on a little bit more. Consumer retail demand has been very flat this year. Michael made the comment. This is consumer sentiment over time. The green line is the mean at 60% feeling positive towards their economic circumstances. But in 2019, the average was 75%. So we don't have a lot of people feeling negative. We have a lot of people feeling indifferent. And some of the bigger changes that have happened is post-COVID, consumers are saving more. Their savings rate as a proportion of household income has increased. Their deposit rates have increased. And some of their other financial behavior and investments have changed quite significantly. And this is really a hangover. A lot of savings were depleted during COVID, and a lot of people were exposed to risks they never imagined during COVID. So we've seen a very negative impact on retail demand. This is retail sales, and all the years are showing year-to-date September. And actually, year-to-date, consumer demand has only increased 2.7%. And the blue bar there is goods, so not services. Services has done quite well, mostly driven by tourism. Excuse me. But goods have only increased 1.2%. Inflation's at 3.88%. So for a lot of companies selling into the domestic market, their volumes have dropped. So it's been very tough for a lot of companies who are doing business specifically amongst Vietnamese consumers. In the short term, the macro picture, we've all seen it, it looks beautiful. It's like a fantastic painting. Consumer demand, though, is flat. It's also challenging business confidence. We ran a survey amongst CEOs in Vietnam, and business confidence is certainly low, with 54% expecting improvement, but a considerable group there expecting conditions to worsen. Now, a lot of these CEOs are selling goods into the Vietnamese market. Some of the aspects they're most worried about, the Blazing Furnace campaign has a negative impact on their sentiment, and consumer price inflation are some of the areas that really concern that these CEOs feel are at risk. So, unlike Michael, I'm always scared following Michael because he's much smarter than I am. But unlike Michael, I think it's going to take a little bit longer for the consumer demand to come back, primarily because I think the consumer sentiment and the business sentiment servicing the domestic market is going to need more confidence from some of the political changes, which are slowly getting confirmed, but probably won't be truly confirmed until Q1 2026. So it's going to take a little bit longer. We do expect a gradual improvement in consumer demand in 2025, but only marginally above inflation. I'm going to talk about some of the routes to market or the channels that consumers are using. If I go back 20 years, the traditional trade, the wet market, the mum and pop shop, 100% of all retail sales. 20 years later, to last year, 66%. So we can see that movement over time. Traditional trade is in blue. The modern trade, so that's organized retail, where there's a cashier, probably air conditioning, is at 27%. E-commerce is at 8%. The grey bar number is just the number of modern trade outlets and how that has been expanding over time. So most of these are through chains and the expansion of those chains. Could anybody tell me or guess which sector of the modern trade, the structured trade, has seen the biggest increase in outlets? Open to the floor, just shout out. Not Eric, because you've read the presentation. Of physical outlets, modern trade, physical outlets. Convenience markets. Anyone else? Which modern trade sector do you think has seen the most number of new stores added? Pharmacy. Who said that? Pharmacy, that man there, you deserve a prize. Indeed, it is pharmacy. And actually within pharmacy, there have been thank you very much for answering. Within pharmacy, there's been two interesting players. FPT, we saw earlier today, increased the number of stores over the last 18 months by 500. So that's a lot of stores every month that they've been opening. Their competitor from Taiyoi Didong or Mobile World, at the same time, has been closing stores in pharmacies. But still, pharmacy, in absolute numbers, has seen the biggest increase in modern trade outlets. As a percentage, it's beauty, health, and wellness stores. And this brand, particularly, Hasaki, have opened 115 new stores over the last 18 months. And you can see the changing structure of the marketplace. This affects where people buy because of availability, but also because of demand. Household affluence. This is the breakdown of monthly income for a household, and it's ranging from very broad categorizations from A to F. A being, can't read that too close, over 1,500, and F being below 395. Sorry, I use dong amounts for these calculations. Not a normal distribution. So actually wealthy households who can really afford to buy consumer goods come into the categories A, B, C, D. That's just about $600 a month plus of the consuming households. They now account for 56% of all households. And there are 28,000 households. Sorry, 28 million households in Vietnam today. These are 2024 numbers. Incremental wealth in the last year hasn't seen huge changes. I'm normally showing bigger growth numbers. We've seen billionaires down. We've seen high net worth of the ultra kind up 2%, millionaires up 2%. Those households earning over $1,000 a month up 1.5%. We've seen remittances from overseas Vietnamese down 4.2%. Admittedly, they were very high during the COVID years, and they've come down subsequently. Could anybody hazard a guess how much money Vietnamese families spend on educating children overseas every year? Again, throw out a number. If you get close, you get a prize. 8 billion. Anyone else? 10 billion. We're going up. Anyone else? Going once? Twice? 1 billion. We're going down significantly. Thank you for that. It's actually 5.1 billion. So there's 215,000 students studying overseas this year, and that's an estimate. This is an estimate of their spend. And it's another sign of the middle class and the affluent in Vietnam that this money is being spent on educating their children overseas. South Korea is the biggest market, probably not one you would have guessed. And you can probably see some of your home countries in the list. So there is middle class acceleration over the long term, perhaps in the very near term. There hasn't been great acceleration. We've seen a lot of migration. We're seeing a rapidly declining birth rate. So we're seeing smaller households with less children, with more money to be spent on them, and more money to be spent on each household. Leapfrogging, somebody mentioned earlier, but the digital economy sees a lot of leapfrogging. The financial markets have seen a lot of leapfrogging of traditional models of conversion. Still 6% using credit cards in this country, very low. Mobile wallets, mobile banking, very high. This is a very recent study. The previous payment method used, 37% using a banking app, 31% using an e-wallet, and then you can see below debit and credit card and cash payments. If I was presenting this 3 years ago, mobile wallets would have been ahead of banking apps. Now the mobile banking apps from the large banks are outperforming the mobile wallets. And probably numbers most of you know has been the rise of domestic, local stock trading accounts in Vietnam. So this year we're expecting to see, I think we're already at 8.5 million. We're expecting to see 8.7 million accounts. Some of these might be multiple accounts amongst one individual, but it also shows that people are putting money in different places and their financial savviness. The digital economy, as I mentioned earlier, is now 7% of GDP. So this causes a lot of change in consumer behavior. Online shopping is a huge part of that at 53%. Ride-hailing and delivery at 18%. It's a staggering increase. In 2015, it was just 2% of GDP. So it's a massive change, and again, it helps explain the dynamism that exists in the Vietnamese market and amongst Vietnamese consumers. Their adaptability and the speed of change that happens in this country is probably only second to China in the 1980s. A lot of e-commerce players in the marketplace. Let's see who's winning and who's losing. So we've seen over time Shopee from 2019 go from 32% of all sales to 51% of all sales through e-commerce. We've seen the rise of TikTok since 2022 at 4%, now at 18%, pushing some of the other players out. So TikTok's a very aggressive challenger. Facebook shops, lots of independent sellers, but have been declining in influence, largely being pushed out by TikTok. We have other players. Then we have Lazada at 6% and Tiki at 1% this year. So rapid changes in the marketplace, disrupted most recently by TikTok. Can anyone tell me the biggest factor that impacts Vietnam's growth? The number one factor. I got to admit, it's the number one factor according to Richard, but the biggest factor that affects Vietnam's growth. Why Vietnam has grown at 6% on average over the last 10 years. Would anybody like to hazard a guess?
Labor costs.
Labor costs, sorry, what did you say? Population. I'm going to go with population. Labor cost is part of it. But the biggest reason really is the structure of the population. And it really boils down to the dependency ratio. For you, thank you. What I mean by the dependency ratio is the number of earners to non-earners. It's very low. It's the lowest in the region. It's mostly very low because of the high participation rate in the labor force of women. 20-year-old plus women, 88% in this country work. If you look at some of our regional competitors, it doesn't get over 50%. So we have a very low dependency ratio. Of course, we have a big and young workforce. 62% of the population is in the workforce. 49% of those today are 20 to 29-year-olds. Participation rate. I have offices in Indonesia. 40% of women work there. 88% in Vietnam. It's a huge contrast, a huge contribution to national output and productivity. Of course, yes, we have a cheap workforce. Whoever mentioned that. You know, our monthly minimum wage in Saigon this year is still just under $200, and in Guangzhou is $333. So, of course, a labor force participation, youth, cost, all help the population structure and the working structure. But it's really the fact that we have 0.64 non-earners compared to earners in this country that really has a significant impact and helps explain why we've developed so fast and grown so fast over the last decade. We have a declining rural population today, in absolute terms, not just as a percentage. We have a declining number of 0 to 14-year-olds, young people. And our biggest growing area is those over 80, then 70, then 60, then 50. So I group them up together. But the aging population, or the silver population, people in my age group, is the fastest growing segment. This is just showing the urbanization rate. It's 38% this year, expected by 2036 to hit 45%, which of course helps bring people to consumer markets, to different retail formats, to require infrastructure, to require real estate. This is the age population profile. If we look at the 50 plus, it's 27%. It'll be 36% in 2036. Michael alluded it to earlier. We've got another good 10 years of, if you like, a demographic dividend before the structure of the population starts to cause issues with not only looking after seniors, but also with productivity rates. The average number of children born in their lifetime was 2.5 in the year 2000. It was 1.94 in 2023. In Ho Chi Minh City, Vinh Long, Dong Nai, Bin Hoa areas, Bin Dung areas, it was much lower at 1.53. So where there's greater urbanization, the birth rate is very much challenged by both parents working, cost of education, and the desire to raise a child and pay for that raising of a child. So there's a lot of opportunities, of course, in the silver generation. They tend to be asset rich, they tend to be reasonably accomplished, and having a great discretionary expenditure availability. But it will create a lot of challenges for policymakers in Vietnam. You know, it's really going to start becoming noticeable in the mid-30s, but by the time we get to the mid-40s, it's going to be really an issue. For those of you who've been coming to Saigon for a long time, you used to be able to see where I live, 8 kilometers away. Now there's a barrage of apartment buildings obstructing the view. That's people moving into smaller households, not living with dependent parents or other relatives, and the needs for the silver generation are going to become quite a big challenge for society policy and also economic policy. So, coming back to good news, I really believe, I say decade, I really believe the next 12 years in Vietnam, yes, there are short-term implications of what's been happening this year, but I believe the next 12 years in Vietnam will be absolutely awesome for investors for these reasons. The reason I say the next 12 years is because of the change in number 8 that is expected to play out, and I think will have an oversized impact on the economy. But these are the reasons that we really are very upbeat for Vietnam's prospects over the next 10, 12 years. Thank you.